Hi, everyone, and welcome to the latest edition of the Three Smart Questions series. Today, we are joined by Chloe Cornish. Chloe is currently the Financial Times correspondent in Mumbai, but until November last year, she was based in Beirut, covering Iraq, Syria, and Lebanon as the Middle East correspondent. When she arrived in Lebanon in 2018, the debt to GDP ratio was so high, it made almost no sense how the economy was functioning. By 2019, it was becoming clear that things were going wrong. And by 2020, Lebanon had tipped into financial meltdown. I know that while the Sri Lankan economic crisis is playing out, many of us have been trying to look for parallels, trying to understand where else has this happened, how did things pan out there, what were some of the outcomes. And Lebanon is one of those countries that a lot of Sri Lankans have been looking at. So Chloe, welcome and thanks very much for taking the time to join us.
Thanks for having me.
So Chloe, as the introduction suggested, you worked in Lebanon for several years and you observed firsthand the economic crisis unfold and the aftermath and some critical points in the protests and the economic collapse. So my first question in this Three Smart Questions episode is, could you tell us a bit about the ground conditions at that time? What did it look like? What were some of the symptoms and features of the crisis and the meltdown? Particularly as the Sri Lankan audience would be interested, given what is going on here.
Sure, I think there are a couple of eerie parallels between the two crises, not least the fact that Lebanon also suffered a punishing civil war that lasted from 1975 until 1990. And so what we're looking at is also a kind of post-Civil War context. That rebuilding of the country led to a very unequal society, and it also kept sort of sectarian warlords who had survived the Civil War in power. So I just think that's important context before we start. In Lebanon, the crisis started kind of slowly at first. So what we saw was the Lebanese lira start to pull away from its pegged level to the dollar in say summer of 2019. That was unnerving for people to start with. And then two things happened. Firstly, Lebanon suffered these terrible wildfires, and then the government proposed a taxation on WhatsApp calls. And these were like the straw that broke the camel's back and triggered mass protests against the entire civil war political class, which was still ruling in Lebanon. So there were these unprecedented nationwide protests against the people in power. During those protests, the banks closed for 2 weeks. And that was completely unprecedented. Even during the Civil War, the banks had never closed like that. And of course, when banks close, people panic about their money. So when they opened again, people wanted to get their money out. And another important thing to remember in the Lebanese context is that a lot of that money was denominated in dollars, highly, highly dollarized economy. The two currencies were used almost interchangeably. So people wanted to get their money out, but to try and prevent a run on the banks informally imposed forms of capital controls. These were completely ad hoc at the start. There was no capital controls law passed by the government, which meant that individual banks were setting individual policies that, of course, created further chaos and panic in the market. So you had a lot of very angry scenes at banks. This is like my predominant memory of the beginning of the crisis, was people queuing at banks, people trying to access their accounts. They simply could not get hold of their savings, their money. As time went on, of course, we had the COVID pandemic hit, and the government at the time was just unable to enact reforms or negotiate effectively with the IMF. And the IMF was seen as the key to unlocking more support from other regional partners, again, a little bit like the Sri Lanka context. So Lebanon then defaulted in March 2020. And it was very messy. It was a totally hard default. There wasn't really a plan. Creditors didn't really know what to expect. So you also had, despite the capital controls that the banks had put in place, money just kept leaving the country. And this is a slightly complicated bit, so I'm not going to go into too much detail, but basically the balance sheets, if you like, of the central bank and the local banks and the government were almost entirely imbricated. So the money that was in the central bank was the bank's money, that was the depositors' money, and that was the money that had been used by the government. So all of these dollars just, it became apparent they weren't there anymore. And there was nothing to withdraw. So that's when we started to see the imports running out. There were shortages of medicine, shortages of baby formula, and then eventually there were very severe fuel shortages. So you saw people waiting in line for days to fill up their car. Again, I think something that's similar in Sri Lanka. There was also very long blackouts, power cuts, and Lebanon already had a very poor electricity system, so local generators were something that people relied on. But at a certain point, even the local generators couldn't get diesel to run, so there was sort of no respite from the electricity cuts. And of course, in the middle of all this, you have the port explosion of August 2020, just adds to the chaos and also brought down the government at the time, setting back negotiations with the IMF. And you had the expense of a huge swathe of Beirut being destroyed. That, of course, spurred the brain drain as people sought to leave the country. So you really had a perfect storm of factors and conditions on the ground for, again, a country that was classified as being middle income, became very untenable, and poverty levels rocketed.
Thanks, Chloe, for painting that picture of what the ground conditions were at the time. Now, my second question is, to what extent was there and has there been since then political and public consensus for the kind of reforms needed to get out of the crisis? I guess there was wide recognition of the mistakes, the policy and economic management mistakes that got Lebanon to that point. But did everyone broadly agree on what needed to be done? And was there and is there commitment in doing it? There was also a huge amount of protests on the streets with prominent voices, activists calling for certain aspects of change. So to what extent was there and has there been political and public consensus for the reforms needed to get Lebanon out of the crisis?
So I think the key reforms that certainly the IMF have highlighted, maybe above all others, are reforms to the banking sector, understanding and accepting the losses at the central bank and working to restructure Lebanon's debt. That's your primary thing. That's a really difficult, complicated task to do. And it is not something that the Lebanese political class have appeared very interested in actually doing. Not only is the banking sector a very important lobby in Lebanon, there's also a lot of political connections between the banks and the halls of power in Beirut, which is not dissimilar to a lot of economies in the world, but Lebanon's economy was really the banking sector was like the tent pole, if you like, of that economy. So very, very powerful, not very keen on being reformed by the government. And I mean, another thing that's very important to understand about the Lebanese context is that the government is a unity government. So there's no sort of formal opposition. This is a leftover from the civil war. So the idea was that every community should be represented in government in a sort of quota fashion. That's designed to keep the peace. But the problem is that means everyone has a veto, and very few decisions are made in that kind of scenario. So politicians tend to be looking after the immediate needs of their own sectarian or identitarian community rather than the good of the country. These politicians, they know they really only get voted in on identitarian politics. So I should say that again. They know they'll only get voted in on identitarian politics. there's not really been a lot of political platforms offered to look at the policy environment. So all of these reforms that we needed, including changes to prevent wasteful public spending, or fixing the state-run electricity company, which had failed to provide power for so many years, it was just difficult to get all of these political factions to back any of those reforms. I mean, in a sense, it was just hard to get them to let go of the cookie jar, because every time you go after one of these sort of sectors that needs to be reformed, that's somebody's special interest. That's one party that controls the state electricity company or has extra influence there. The spoils had been shared for such a long time. And that was one of the reasons that government had been so poor and the economy had been so badly managed. It was difficult to get these parties to let go and accept that reforms were needed. And to illustrate finally the depth of this problem, it's only been in the last month or so, only in April, that Lebanon was able to get a staff level agreement with the IMF to unlock $3 billion worth of financial support. Only $3 billion, of financial support, all contingent on reforms. The crisis has been going on since 2019 in some way or another, and it's only now that they've been able to have any kind of coherent front that they can present to the IMF. And they won't get the money unless they're able to show that they've done those reforms. So the hope is of many that the need to do reforms, the fact that the IMF won't disperse that money unless there are reforms shown, that will push the political class into having to do something. But we just are going to have to see.
And on that point, Chloe, we'll shift to our third and final question, which is more about where to from here. So in your view, what is the biggest risk facing Lebanon moving forward? Is it a recurrence of public outrage? Is it political gridlock? Is it potential successive aftershocks on the economy? Is it more political attrition, perhaps? Because I saw a recent UN report that laid the blame for the crisis squarely at the feet of the political class and public officials. So in your view, what's the biggest risk facing Lebanon moving forward? And perhaps, maybe to balance that out, what you probably most optimistic about in light of what you just said, that they finally got the staff level agreement?
Yeah, you're absolutely right to mention those UN and World Bank reports. Just extraordinary language that you see in those, definitely worth reading if anyone's interested in learning more about these contexts. The World Bank, I believe it was, actually called Lebanon's recession a deliberate depression. That was the title of the reports, in recognition of the role that the political class has played in basically destroying Lebanon's economy. So what are the big risks going forward? Well, Lebanon just held elections, and that actually did see some change to the political landscape for the first time in quite a long time. Around 11 independent MPs, I think it was, have actually obtained seats in parliament. Now, that doesn't mean the traditional parties lost their hold on power, though. It just shifted the balance somewhat. And their track record of governing Lebanon is so miserable that I really worry mostly about them continuing to screw it up. I mean, that to me seems the sort of integral risk, that the same people are still really around. Do they know what they're doing any more than they did before? Are they any more interested in the good of the nation than they were before? These are all open questions, and I really hope that we get surprised. That would be great. I'd love to be wrong, but unfortunately, the writing on the wall was there for a very long time. Actually, in the case of Lebanon, it was one of those situations where for 20 years people have been saying, it's got to go. It's got to go at some point. There's no way that this can carry on. And of course, it did for a very long time. But the further up you get, in a way, the longer you continue, the harder the landing is at the end. So, we just see in Lebanon a system of government that's really very unmanageable and very ill-equipped to deal with crises, even crises this severe. So I really hope that the new faces in Parliament might be able to help direct change, make a louder voice for kind of sensible, sustainable reform and change that will benefit the nation overall. Do I feel like it's very, very likely? Yeah, I mean, I wouldn't want to say because I'm not there right now. If there's anything I feel optimistic about, it is the fact that those independent MPs have been elected, that there clearly was some appetite for change amongst the electorate, despite there being an extremely low turnout to those elections. So, you know, one has to hope that the protest movement and the kinds of consciousness raising, yeah, so what's the phrase I'm looking for here? The raising of awareness during the mass protest has left an imprint on what people think they can expect from their leaders. And hopefully in the future, there's maybe a bit less emphasis on protecting certain communities and more of an emphasis on trying to do the right thing for the whole nation. Lebanon is in a very difficult region. It has big challenges, like there's still, you know, very large populations of refugees living in Lebanon. These are not small issues. No one should blame the refugees for the economic crisis, but, you know, it's not like Lebanon doesn't have enough problems as it is, where it is, without having terrible governance and an economic crisis to deal with. So is the outlook really sunny? No. Is there possibility for change? Maybe.
That was a great assessment, Chloe. And, you know, a lot of the things that you said right there towards the end have a lot of resonance with what's going on in Sri Lanka right now. You know, there's no, you know, perfect parallel between what goes on in countries between crises, but certainly I think looking at some of those red flags, looking at some of the ways in which things panned out, looking at how leaders dealt with the issues and how people reacted could be interesting points for Sri Lanka to look out for as well. You are now closer to Sri Lanka than you were before, based just across the water, as it were. So we look forward to seeing more of you as the Sri Lanka crisis pans out. And thank you so much for taking the time to share your take and your experience based in Lebanon as the correspondent for the FT before, and for joining us on 3 Smart Questions.
Thanks so much. And I mean, just with us having gone through this before, I'm just so sorry that this is happening. I know how stressful a time it is, how hard it is on people's families, workplaces. I mean, I wouldn't wish that on anybody. And, you know, I really hope that in Sri Lanka, there's a much faster resolution to the crisis than in Lebanon, and a much swifter, you know, ability to deal with that debt restructuring and so on. Because as we've seen with Lebanon, the longer it goes on, it definitely does not get any better. The problem does not go away, however much the politicians would wish it would. So let's hope for a swift resolution and swift action on this.
Thank you, Chloe. I think that's all of our wishes also, and that there'll be political consensus and commitment to the reform. And as you said, you know, there's a heightened public awareness and public consciousness about better governance, better economic policies. And I think, you know, on average, that bodes well for Sri Lanka's economic future in the long term. Thank you very much once again.